Welcome everybody to this session hosted by the New Zealand Fabian Society. It's so good to see such a strong turnout on this cold evening. My name's Ollie Nees, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event titled Maxing Out, What's Next for Progressives. And with me on stage today are two Maxes of the highest calibre, Max Rashbrooke and Max Harris. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Now, these two really do need no introduction, but if you'll just allow me a quick refresher, Max Rashbrooke is a writer and researcher who will be known to many of you for his work on democratic renewal and economic inequality. He's the author and editor of a number of books, such as Inequality in New Zealand Crisis, Government for the Public Good, and Too Much Money, How Wealth Inequality is Unbalancing Aotearoa New Zealand. He writes regularly for a number of papers, and as of recently, he has also helped launch the Institute of Democratic and Economic Analysis, otherwise known as IDEA. Max Harris is a lawyer, campaigner, and author, and the author of the book, The New Zealand Project. He's worked for the UN Development Programme in New York as an economic policy advisor in the United Kingdom Parliament, and here in New Zealand for Action Station, as well as many other things. Before we get into it, just a quick note of housekeeping. The bathrooms, if you need them, are behind, on that side, behind the lifts. Stairs, if you need them, are on the other side of the lifts. The reason we're here today is because we are living in a time of extraordinary political change. All around the world, including here at home in New Zealand, it seems that the political right is insurgent, and with it, progressive values and ideals are under attack. In some ways, what we're seeing feels very familiar. It's an old story of corporate interests being favoured over the public good, of the marginalised being scapegoated. But in other ways, the story feels new and disorienting. So how should progressives make sense of these developments? And how, in Aotearoa, what might a progressive response look like? To answer these questions, the plan is for me to say not much more than what I've said already and to pass it over to these two. So we'll spend 50 minutes or so in conversation, and then there'll be space for questions from the audience. To get us started, Max, perhaps if each of you just want to share some opening remarks and perhaps let us know what's been preoccupying you lately.
When you say Max, you might need to...
It's kind of a Schrodinger's Max situation.
Yeah. We could go very boarding school. It could be at Harris and Rashbrooke. But no, look, thanks for hosting us here. Ollie, thanks very much, everyone, for coming. It's a real pleasure being on stage after so many years of receiving emails intended for you, being mistaken for you at times. It's a pleasure to actually be sharing the same forum. So in terms of what I've been working on recently, well, as Ollie mentioned, I've recently, as in the last 10 months, helped found a think tank called the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. And our mission is to tackle what we see as the intertwined problems of poverty and political exclusion. So addressing democratic threats to democracy, democratic disengagement, widening economic disparities, and the way in which those two things entwine and create the conditions, I think, in which forces, reactionary forces like authoritarian populism can grow and fester. So we're a small startup think tank. I'm working away on the first project, which is about welfare to work policy and what more we could do to support people in their aspirations for paid work. That's going to be coming out in the next couple of months. If you want to hear more about all of this, do go to the website idea.institute.nz and sign up. But that, I can tell you, launching a think tank in New Zealand when you don't have access to vast amounts of corporate funding is a big mission, but it's one that I'm excited about, and one that I hope will bear fruit in the coming years.
Kia ora tātou, nice to be here. Thanks to Fabians for putting this on and for supporting me in getting down from Auckland. I think the Wellington Fabians has become a really exciting hub of progressive thinking nationwide, so credit to the Fabians. And Max stole what I was going to say about him, which is I've definitely, I think, benefited from some haziness about which Max I might be at different points in time. And several weeks ago, someone said, "Oh, great piece in the spin-off today," and I had to say that was the other Max. I also just wanted to say I don't want to embarrass you, but it's nice to be alongside you because I've really respected your work for a long time, and in particular, admire how. I hope it's okay for me to say. I think you and I both have been lucky and fortunate in our lives in certain respects, but you've really chosen to examine issues of wealth and inequality in this country, and really made a big difference in that work that you've done, among many other things. But just to answer Ollie's question, I do legal work some of the week, partly to pay my rent, and partly because I am interested in how law can be an instrument of progressive change in the fight against austerity, in supporting human rights and the criminal justice system. And then the other work I do is with Action Station, in particular right now on a project called Dental for All, which is about bringing dental within the public healthcare system. And with two other people in that project, we're making some good progress, I think. And the other thing I've been interested in the last few months especially, I think, is political education and how we can join the dots for all of us on how austerity, cuts, privatisation and attacks on te tiriti or waitangi are all connected, how we can raise consciousness about those things and not just understand those things better, but move people into action to tackle those forces and reactionary movements.
I want to start by zooming out. So I think if you head downstairs to Unity Books right now, you'll find a large number of recently published books that seek in different ways to diagnose or theorise what's happening internationally. You've got books such as Disaster Nationalism, Techno-Feudalism, Neo-Feudalism, and so on. The isms keep proliferating. I'm interested in how you think we should make sense of what's happening globally right now. Are we seeing the end of neoliberalism, or is this just a refresh of it? Max Harris, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. This is a big question. I try not to go on too much, but it's a question that deserves, proper thinking. I think what we're seeing differs in different places, whether you're looking at the right in Argentina, the right in the US, the centre-left in Australia and the UK, but I think there are some common threads. I think there's no doubt that we are seeing a surge of a very particular reactionary, often racist, often nationalist, right-wing politics that is targeting a series of groups, including the poor, the disabled, trans people, Indigenous people, and many others. And I think in some ways we're seeing the reconnection of different parts of the right, so a libertarian pro-market right and a more racist anti-immigrant nationalist right. And to add another book, or if you want to explore this in a bit more detail, there's someone called Quinn Slobodian who I think has written really well on how actually these two parts have kind of always been in the right of the last 40 years, the sort of racist reactionary forces and the kind of pro-market libertarian forces. And he's got a new book coming out called Hayek's Bastards on this theme. It's a good topic, good title. Just to address the last part of your question, Ollie, I think, in my view, we aren't seeing the death of neoliberalism because neoliberalism was never just about a small state. So also to break down that term, neoliberalism is what we usually refer to as those changes in the 80s and 90s, which involved cutting progressive taxes, smashing unions, reducing benefits, redesigning the government as a company. And what we saw in the 80s and 90s was not just a reduction in the size of the state, because we actually saw at the same time an expanding prison population and expanding militaries in many places. So I think the best way to understand neoliberalism was a reorganization of the state to serve certain interests. So a re-gearing of the state but to maintain the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. And once we see neoliberalism in that way, I don't think what we see now is the end of neoliberalism, but a kind of rebooting of it. And I think, just to say one last thing, there are some new features on the right, in particular a new approach to the state. So a willingness, for example, in the US to use the state in economic policy more proactively, for example, in the reintroduction of tariffs. But I don't think that means the end of neoliberalism, and I can say more about that, but that's enough for now.
Yeah, look, I'd agree with a lot of that. Although I do sometimes wonder about the language around this. And I was having this conversation recently with someone who spent a lot of time, I guess, sort of fighting some of these battles on the left, and they were saying to me, is neoliberalism still the concept that we're dealing with? Is it still current? Does that language still work? And this may not be a view that everyone in the audience agrees with, but I often feel that the tide has run out on that term and the use of that term, because I think it has been, for me, used so much and overused sometimes that it has lost a lot of its meaning. I think there are some people whose attribution of everything to neoliberalism is so sweeping that, if their tomato crop failed one year, that would be neoliberalism in action. And I'm just not sure how much the term means, particularly to people of a generation younger than ours, who never experienced the 80s and for whom it is just sort of some distant kind of far off time when mysterious things happened. So, I tend to talk more about things like hyper-individualism, say, or market fundamentalism, which are terms that you can immediately understand what they are. And that's what is still going on in part. But I also think you're right. There is now, parts of the energy on the American conservative right are strikingly big statist. Tariffs, which are a sort of neoliberal nightmare, onshoring, all the talk about manufacturing. A lot of sort of the intellectuals who are supporting Trump are people who look at the decline of American community and they see something really profound there. They see hollowed out communities. They see all the damage of the last 30, 40 years. Things that progressives have sometimes talked about, but maybe haven't as much as they should have done. Particularly in America, I think the Democrats have been very complicit in a view that, you just sort of, you let the market do its thing and that's efficient and the jobs will end up, where they will end up. And ironically, in America, it's conservatives who are saying, hang on, often something terrible has happened to these communities, particularly communities that were once supported by good manufacturing jobs. And so they're saying, well, how do we bring that back? And of course, that's a very regressive agenda in many ways. It's valorising a certain kind of post-World War II community that was, very patriarchal. And it's a very white vision, that conservatives have in the US. But nonetheless, they have picked up on something real, and their concerns about that, I don't know what you think. I think a lot of those concerns don't fit neatly, even if you wanted to use the word neoliberalism, don't fit neatly under that kind of umbrella.
Maybe I could just pick up on a couple of things that you said. We were going to try to do some respectful disagreement or tonight, just to make it interesting.
We'll see how well that goes.
I think I agree that neoliberalism, when we're trying to mobilise people, isn't always a really helpful term, and sometimes we might be better off just talking about the new right again, or a new resurgent right. But a couple of things I think are important to remember. One is that that term was used, by Milton Friedman, by Hayek, by the economists who kind of spearheaded a lot of the ideas that were implemented in the 80s and 90s. I think it's helpful to keep in mind that this was a deliberate political project, but perhaps while we think about the language we use for it. I do agree that when I've spoken about the 80s and 90s, people react more strongly when we talk about, for example, being a market society, or talking about loneliness as an outgrowth of a hyper-individualistic era. So one really interesting stat is that Stats New Zealand measures loneliness among age groups, and the loneliest age group in New Zealand is not older people, it's the youngest age group measured, the 16 to 24-year-olds, I think it is. And you can connect that potentially to growing up in the shadow of the economics of the 80s and 90s. And maybe just to pick up on one last point that you made, I think you're right that it doesn't necessarily have a lot of purchase for people that have grown up after the 80s and 90s, but the fact that those ideas have become normalised might be extra reason to draw attention to the fact that that's the oxygen that we breathe now, or the poisonous air that we all breathe now, and maybe we need to kind of see it and name it in order to move beyond it. And possibly you agree with a lot of that.
No, and absolutely your emphasis on loneliness, I think that's crucial. And again, that's the community dimension. And I think that's something that's been missing from a huge amount of politics in the last 20 to 30 years. I wrote a column a few years back where I'd gone through I've cut and pasted a whole ton of Jacinda Ardern speeches when she was Prime Minister, and looked, well, what use is being made of the idea of community in these speeches? And it was either entirely absent, or it was what you might call an empty signifier. She would say something like, oh, well, and obviously, the Labour Party supports families and communities, and then move on, with nothing substantive said about it. Now, that's not true in all New Zealand politics. I think, stating the blindingly obvious, there's a much clearer sense of community in Te Ao Māori and in Māori politics. But I think in the Pākehā side of things, we've really lost a sense of, well, what does a political agenda look like that builds really strong communities? And obviously government can't force people to have good communities, and nor should it try, but it can create the conditions in which people can have those communities. So I think that's one thing that's really missing. And the other thing I'd say is that, and this is a difference of emphasis rather than disagreement, while you're quite right that there's, if you look at the new right and what's going on around the world, there are absolutely illegitimate grievances being fostered. So people are getting anti-climate change propaganda pushed at them. They're being encouraged to demonise migrants and take a kind of regressive patriarchal approach to the home and all sorts of other things. We also have to remember that there are very, very legitimate grievances, and I don't think you disagree with this, that the right are feeding on. For me, no one's ever battered the analysis by a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called Catherine Kramer. And she has spent years, if not decades, and I've written a bit about this, going around and interviewing rural people in her state. And she started this way before the Trump ascendancy, talking to people and saying, what's feeding your anger? Why are you feeling so left out? Why are you feeling so reactionary? And they basically said to her time and again that they felt that they weren't getting their fair share of three things. And one was sort of the fruits of the economy and public spending. Second one was political power, so they felt like all the decisions were taken somewhere else. And the third one was respect for their way of life. Now that third one's tricky because that way of life that they want to defend has some elements that I don't think should be endorsed. But the first two, absolutely, there are so many people who feel like they're missing out on the economy's benefits and they're missing out on their share of decision-making power. And those are absolutely legitimate grievances, and I think it's really troublesome that the people who are speaking best to that at the moment are some of the most malign actors in world politics.
Picking up on that, I'm interested in your thoughts on how New Zealand fits in. So we've seen a pivot to the right here in the last 2 years. To what extent do you think that is being driven by the same forces, say, that are driving Trumpism in the United States? Is it the same stuff, or is it something quite unique here? Max Rashbrooke, I pick you.
I think there's absolutely elements of it that are being imported. And look, and just this morning we've had a moment that I think should really shock us with Winston Peters further pursuing a kind of anti-trans agenda. And look, that is a complicated subject that emits of a range of views, but I think no matter what one's views on the subject, it would be very hard to see anything positive in what Peters is doing in the way that he is going about it, and the very obvious desire to foster division and to try to stigmatise people. And he's accompanied that with threats to defund a national broadcaster. And that's all very Trumpian, trying to make an enemy of the media. And we have a problem with very low trust in the media in New Zealand. Only a third of the country has trust in the media. Talking to people inside this government, they would say that I mean, certainly for Act in New Zealand First, it's probably almost a positive now to be offside with the media, where once that would have been regarded as a problem. For a lot of those, the fan base of those parties, that's now a positive thing. So that stuff is there, and some of it's important and it's really troubling. One final sort of counterpoint, though, is that if you think about National just as a party, their re-election strategy is almost entirely dependent on the economy recovering next year and growing at 2 to 3%. The biggest threat to that at the moment in the world is Donald J. Trump and his tariffs. So actually, for parts of the New Zealand conservative movement, Trump is an absolute nightmare.
Just to add a few points, I think echoing what Max Rashbrooke said, I think first of all, there are clearly elements of those political battles from the US and elsewhere being imported here. Those attacks on the media, those attacks on trans people, the cuts to public services, the swinging decimation of the public sector. Probably no one in this city needs to be talked to about that. I do think it's interesting to see the persistence of pro-market ideas in this country in particular, and I think there's less of this turn to a big state on the right in this country than in the US and the UK. So you see reintroduction of tariffs by Trump, but you also saw in the UK a Department of Industrial Strategy set up under the UK Conservatives. I think the New Zealand National Party and others on the right are much slower to kind of turn to the state, and there's a much longer commitment to a certain kind of free trade agreement, which often ties the hands of government. So I think there is a particular New Zealand flavour to what is going on. And just to touch on a word that's been used a lot in progressive discussions in recent months, Atlas. I think there are links between New Zealand think tanks and international right-wing think tanks, such as Atlas. I don't think... I think the Atlas network is a problem, but I don't think it's the whole problem, and I actually think in some ways we make our challenge both too hard and too easy by talking too much about the Atlas network. We make it kind of too easy because we make it out as if there's just like a couple of puppet masters controlling everything, and we just have to kind of take them down to beat the right. And we, in some ways, make it too hard because I think it's sort of a bit disempowering, and it removes our agency to kind of to tell this kind of story rather than to talk about how we build up our own power. And the other point I wanted to add is that sometimes I think discussions of Atlas can distract us from the network of New Zealand think tanks that have interlocking power and that have built up power since the 80s and 90s. So I'm thinking about the Taxpayers Union, the Free Speech Union, the New Zealand Centre for Political Research, particularly kind of anti-tutility, the Israel Institute, and several other think tanks that have worked in lockstep to push forward these ideas.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. And sometimes, there's this discourse that I see a lot of people saying, oh, well, we have to understand that these things that are happening in New Zealand, these attacks, are globally coordinated. And I sometimes think, do we? Do we have to? Is that one of the most important things we could understand? Because if these things are wrong in of themselves, what does it add to our understanding to think that they might have happened somewhere else? I think that is often less significant than than people sometimes argue. And I would agree. I think, worrying sometimes about these international, the Atlas network or whatever, can be an excuse for people to not look harder at their own thinking and their own arguments and their own activism, and think about, I often think people, would be better off thinking, well, how do I do a better job of what I'm trying to do, rather than worrying so much about what these other forces might be doing. Having said that, there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about something like an Atlas network, potentially. Obviously, if there's foreign money being used to sway debate in New Zealand, every country has always had a long-standing concern about interference in its own activities. So that's a legitimate concern. Although personally, I think if you're an incredibly wealthy American, would you be putting your money into New Zealand politics? Would you even know where New Zealand is? Quite possibly not. So I don't know how much of that really goes on. And obviously if that means that the debate in New Zealand is imbalanced because there is much greater resources on one side than the other, that is also a problem. Although I'm not sure there's anything that could be done realistically about either of those problems, even if they were proven to exist. I think mostly where it's useful to think about those international connections is if it helps you understand what's actually lying underneath the things you see on the surface. So if you see, a certain kind of argument coming out of the States about, family and community and family values and, getting back to the good old days of one income supporting a family, and then it turns out that that is being used as an argument to get women out of the workforce and back into the home, then that is very useful information because that helps you better understand something that is happening in New Zealand. Otherwise, the existence of some of these international networks, I am less convinced that it is such a massive problem.
Maybe just to riff on that a bit, I think I broadly agree. To add a couple of points, I suppose if there are these international connections between the right overseas and New Zealand, it might also change the tactics that we use to push back. And it might encourage us to be more in solidarity internationally if what we're facing is kind of international threat. And I think you were making this point, but just to tease it out a bit more, I also think it is really helpful to map out the kind of tactics and the playbook of conservatives and reactionary forces so that we can prepare to push back. And for example, one playbook that's gotten quite a lot of airtime in the last few months is actually this line from Noam Chomsky, which is that the kind of privatization playbook is always the same, where you ground down a public service, you defund it, you make people angry, and then you say the only answer is to privatize it. And when you frame things like that, or you say, okay, let's look at these tactics that have been tried overseas, it alerts us, I guess it primes us, and it reminds us, and I think you were saying this too, that this is not some newfangled criticism, say, of the New Zealand state that is unique to the New Zealand state. This is just a criticism that's being deployed ideologically in many places around the world, and maybe we can get some power from seeing that.
I'd like to stick with the theme of privatisation. Max Rashbrooke, you've written about this topic in recent months, and in a piece you wrote for the Spin-Off, you described this push toward privatisation as arising on some level from a failure of imagination. What do you mean by that?
What I meant by that is that although there are absolutely huge problems with the approach that the government is taking to all these issues about how we get things done, about how we develop infrastructure, about what the state's ownership of assets should be, those ideas go on relatively unchallenged and I think are accepted to a greater degree than they would be otherwise because people don't hear a compelling alternative. For instance, if you think about public-private partnerships, where the government asks a private consortium to design, build, finance and operate a piece of public infrastructure, a hospital, a road, a school, that has all kinds of problems. It's expensive because it costs private companies more to borrow. Drawing up contracts where you try to foresee everything that will happen in the 30-year lifetime of a private company running a hospital, for instance, is an absolute nightmare. When you don't predict those things that you might want to do with the public asset, when you then try to do them, the private operator says, well, you can do that, but we'll charge you $40,000 to do it because it's not in the contract. So public-private partnerships are a very expensive failure. But it is also true that conventional public ownership and running of things is not always brilliant, and it hasn't been particularly good, arguably, in recent decades. So while I don't think the average New Zealander is particularly excited about public-private partnerships, far from it, I think they look at the state of our infrastructure, the way that we run state-owned enterprises, which seem often, I think the average person seems like a real mess. They're sort of commercial, but sort of not, and they don't seem to deliver a huge amount of sort of commercial value, but they're not really all that pleasant to interact with, and maybe not delivering credible quality of service. And people think, well, maybe we should try public-private partnerships because the current version of it doesn't seem to be working very well. And so what I'm pointing to there is I think we need to have a lot more new thinking. We need new models about how we deliver public services, how we run big pieces of public infrastructure. One model that I've talked a bit about and which you see discussed internationally is, say, the model for running Paris's water services, which obscurely for the French were privatised a few decades ago, run incredibly poorly by one of the French contracting giants, taken back and then taken back into public ownership. But not to sort of renationalise in the conventional sense of, well, we'll just effectively get this run through ministers' delegation. Paris Water now has a publicly elected board that includes technical experts, includes some political appointees, but it also has representatives of ordinary Parisians. So it's got consumer representatives on it. And so those people on that board are able to, each of them sort of embody different things that that agency needs to do. So they're able to sort of give it a multifaceted but coherent mandate. And the result is it's running much better than it was under privatisation. Costs have gone down, service has gone up. I think we need to be able to present people with a better way of running public services. Otherwise, the criticism of what the government does, I think, just leaves people wondering about how these things can actually work.
Max Harris, any reflections on that?
Yeah, I agree that we need to be thinking about alternative models of public ownership, and I worked in the UK Parliament for a period with John McDonnell, who was the Shadow Chancellor in the UK Labour Party, and one bit of work that he'd done before I started working with him that a lot of people were very positive about was this report on essentially new models of public ownership, and the idea was his party supported bringing rail, mail, water, and then broadband into public ownership, but in new ways, and exactly as Max was saying. So things like unions on boards or local communities in positions of leadership, and rethinking that sort of Morrisonian mid-20th century model of public ownership. And I think people were energised by that. Sometimes there's a different version of this argument that says, we can't go back to old thinking, and the state itself is kind of old thinking. So we need to kind of, lock ourselves only within thinking about options in the private sector, and I think that's wrong. And so I think you're right to say we also need to think about, how can public ownership be rejuvenated? And I think key, and maybe we'll come back to this, to a lot of what we're talking about tonight is rebuilding the social state and rebuilding government and renewing faith in government. And I know Max has written a whole book on this, and it's something we're both passionate about.
Before we get to the future, Max Harris, I know you've been giving some thought to this government's pushback against the treaty. I've heard some people analyse that as in some ways related to the government's pro-corporate agenda. Is that a view that you subscribe to?
Yes. So Rupert O'Brien wrote a really good piece in the spin-off on this, so on the ties between the Treaty Principles Bill and corporatisation and privatisation. And from a legal perspective, he talked about how treaty principles in the 80s, 90s and 2000s had been a roadblock for privatisation, and how part of the motivation behind the Treaty Principles Bill was to kind of remove this roadblock. But I also think there were a couple of other motivations. I think it was about building a base for the government, and I think it was a response to a surge in te tiriti education and thinking in particular in the last 10 years. Short answer is yes, I think that was part of the connection. And just to pause maybe briefly on the Treaty Principles Bill, I mean, how many people in this room heard of the Treaty Principles Bill? Put up your hand, just to get us active. And how many people submitted on it? No problem if you didn't, everyone's busy. But yeah, I think, just to say, I think, that was a political success. And in a world that feels very gloomy, that campaign, which was led by some really amazing Māori activists, including Cassie Hartendorp at Action Station, resulted in this massive hikoi that many of you will know about. A record number of select committee submissions, lots of people asking me what a select committee submission was, and appearing in a select committee for the first time. And I think we should hold on to that and also think about how solidarity between Māori and non-Māori is critical to the future of progressive politics in this country.
The hikoi does stand out as a high point, I suppose, in terms of the public's response to this government's agenda. Are there any aspects of this government's agenda that you think have received insufficient scrutiny? Max Rashbrooke? Or in the highlights?
Couple of things. One are the attacks on workers' rights. I've got a piece in the spin-off tomorrow which is just a list of them, which doesn't sound very exciting, but I think, I was sort of talking to people as it was getting me to help draw up this list, and they were saying, God, actually, when you see it all in one place, it's really significant, and you don't realise because it's been very much a piecemeal assault. So it's included things like, winding back the protections for new employees in the first 30 days, extending 90-day trials, making it harder for people to get compensation when they take personal grievances, winding back other kinds of union access, watering down health and safety standards. There's a members' bill which would sort of make it very easy for employers to basically offer employees cash payouts to make them go away, sort of things that people would feel compelled to take even if there's notionally no compulsion. And the list goes on and on and on and on. But because it's just happened one little bit by little bit, I don't think that's probably had the focus it deserves. I could go on, but that's a good start. Max?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe I'll just add 3 more things. So, one, quiet financial deregulation. So before the election, I spoke to someone who was actually working at the Reserve Bank, and he said, I think some parts of the agenda of the right have shifted. Like, I don't think anyone believes in financial deregulation anymore. And I wasn't sure, and I'm not saying I predicted it, but the government pushed through quite quiet financial deregulation, and I think the changes on bank capital requirements that are being engineered, in my view, in the Reserve Bank at the moment fall into that too. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, there was quite a lot of attention paid to the initial whaikaha cuts on March 18th last year, but as many disabled community people and advocates have mentioned, there have been a sort of sustained onslaught on the disabled community after that's gotten much less attention. And this is an onslaught on a social security system that is already profoundly underfunded and providing far too little support for the people who need it the most in our society, right? So, 53% of people on welfare in 2019 had a serious disability or health condition or cared for someone with a serious disability or health condition. These are the people we're talking about who are hurt by those cuts. And related to that, I would say third, the attack on welfare generally. And I think we've seen that in the reintroduction of sanctions, money management, a failed system in the UK where I saw people walking around with deep shame about having money management cards that they had to pull out in shops. A system that's been, relatively quietly introduced, and I think the lack of coverage does reflect like a long-standing lack of attention paid to people on welfare in this country. Another perhaps surprising statistics. Do you know how many people in New Zealand owe debt to MSD, to the welfare department? 1 in 9, over 1 in 9 people. That's how many people are saddled by quite serious debt and who've been hurt by a lot of this government's changes on welfare. And yeah, like Max R, I could go on, but I'll mention those 3 as a start.
Well, let's move now to what a progressive response might look like. And I want to start at the conceptual level, if that's okay. So in recent months, this concept of abundance has emerged in the discourse, particularly in the US as a result of a book by that name. What do you make of this concept of abundance as a way to think about progressive change, and what other frameworks might be useful?
Yeah, good question. I'm halfway through the book of the same name, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a new book by Ezra Klein, the New York Times columnist, and a guy, Derek Thompson, I think. And its basic argument is that progressives have adopted a scarcity mindset and have been insufficiently have not been willing to embrace the idea that we can have and that we need an abundance of housing and an abundance of infrastructure and an abundance of innovation and technological development that will help us tackle issues like climate change. I wouldn't say it's a particularly compelling book. It reads like a cobbled together set of his New York Times essays and puts a huge amount of store in the idea that we just build more things, then everything will be all right, and all the other problems will sort of magically vanish. Whereas, if we just build a huge number more things, then we might just use all that extra energy and resources and other things to continue despoiling the planet, for instance. I do think that there is something interesting there on a couple of levels. Klein and his co-author are identifying an issue where it has become very difficult to build things often, in particularly green infrastructure. The delays on getting those sorts of things off the ground can be immense, renewable energy. Also, I think they speak to a culture, a concern about how government works in New Zealand, and that it has become very slowed down, very procedural, that there are too many veto points, that it is too difficult to get things done. The problem, of course, is that all those sort of veto points and all those things that we now ask people to think about when they're putting forward public projects are all important things. What are you not going to do in the service of speeding up government? Are you not going to think about whether this new piece of infrastructure is environmentally friendly? Are you not going to think about who's being hired to work in it and whether you're making good use of local staff? Are you not going to think about the design quality? Are you not going to think about its impact on the disabled community? Are you not going to, and so on and so forth? So it's not really clear how we get out of this, and just saying abundance 1,000 times is not going to help. I do agree with them that haven't been building anywhere enough housing, although I think the issues around that are more complicated than they suggest. So I'm a bit sceptical about it, but I do, at the level of the vibe, if you like, I do think that they're onto something. While it is extremely irritating and very implausible to hear people on the conservative right say, we don't really need to change our behaviour around the environment because technology will come and save us, it is surely equally implausible to say that there will be no technology invented in the next 20 or 30 years that will help us. And so, yes, we should be thinking about what some of those technological solutions are and what we could be doing to accelerate them. And I do think we should be optimistic about the future. But yeah, I'm sceptical about just how much the idea of abundance has to offer on that level.
I'm still waiting for my copy from Unity Auckland, so I wanted Max to speak to this. But
a victory for Unity Wellington, I might say.
But I've read a couple of pieces about that book and ideas around it. And as Max said, it's partly about housing density and government getting back in the business of building things again, as I understand it. I shall come back to it once I've read it. But maybe just to say one or two things about that. I do think there's a sort of a battle for what is at the heart of progressive ideas today, and I do think there's a risk of while I'm a supporter of increasing density, and I think over time it lowers rent, I think there's a risk of that being the idea for progressives. First of all, because I think often those who talk about intensification don't have a concern for public housing in particular, which I think should continue to be a progressive priority. Secondly, in a way it involves like a flight from the state, because it often involves reliance on private construction. And so as an example, I heard an Auckland councillor say to me that he would support privatisation of some public assets to enable housing density, and someone who would be considered progressive. So I think there's a real tension there, and I do think it's really important that we hold on to public ownership and public services and public infrastructure as progressives, while also supporting housing density. As you said, I think a debate about how we build things better is important, and I've done some work with others on a Ministry of Green Works and rejuvenating the old Ministry of Works for the 21st century to build state housing at scale and to build interregional passenger rail. But yeah, I should wait to read the book before saying anything more.
Oh no, I think that's really valid, and I think what's unhelpful in the book is the kind of the false opposition it sets up. So they make the point that in America, when you look at homelessness and you try to work out what is correlated with homelessness and what are the big drivers of homelessness, it's not always the things that you would expect. So in American states, for instance, there's no correspondence between levels of mental health problems and homelessness. There's no real correlation between levels of poverty and homelessness. What there is an extremely strong correlation between is levels of homelessness and failure to build sufficient amounts of housing. So I think the argument is compelling to that point. But they then push the argument too far and they say, well, therefore, dezoning, liberalisation of zoning, just building more housing solves all your problems. And they say, look at Houston. Houston, virtually no zoning laws, incredibly easy to build things, and they have a very, very low homelessness problem. And it just takes someone like Timothy Noah, writing, I think, in one of the American magazines, probably the New Republic, to say, well, yes, but if you go back a decade or so, Houston had an appalling homelessness problem and exactly the same policies around zoning and house building. So it's a classic yes and. Yes, you need to build more houses, and you need really good policies that are aimed at helping the very poorest. And that's where classically state housing has had a role in New Zealand, and one that I think is really important. On a sort of per population adjusted basis, we have about 40,000 fewer state homes now than we did in 1991. If we'd just built state housing in line with the increase in population, in line with the increase in the number of dwellings in New Zealand, we would have 40,000 more state homes today, and that would probably accommodate every single one of the people who are classed as being homeless in New Zealand, which is over 100,000. Now, so I absolutely agree on that point. The Ministry of Green Works is an interesting one, because that's an issue where we have another, by most people's standards, extremely polite disagreement. Because obviously Max has put forward the idea that we should reanimate the old Ministry of Works, called it a Ministry of Green Works, and that I totally agree with. And I agree with it sort of up to the point of thinking that one of the big problems with the New Zealand state is it just isn't even powered up to be a good purchaser, to be a good contractor. The New Zealand state has been so hollowed out by privatisation and by contracting that it doesn't even have the ability to strike a good deal with the big firms with whom it is contracting. So, I think a Ministry of Green Works, at least as a super procurer, as a bunch of people who are really, really good at extracting the best possible deal out of the private sector, is absolutely essential. What I haven't ever been so sure about is, should we take the step further and have the Ministry of Green Works that actually does all the work itself, that actually employs all the tradies, the electricians, the plumbers, the builders to do the work? Because that, in my understanding, wasn't often even how the old Ministry of Works operated. A lot of the time was working with contractors. And would it be efficient? Would it work well to have that huge workforce, or would it sort of fall prey to some of the kind of the inefficiencies of big quasi-monolithic bureaucracies? Is a really live question for me. But I think you have a different take on that.
Yeah, maybe just to mention briefly, because disagreement can be interesting. I think first of all, what I'd say is that that problem of contracting and government contracting is definitely one that can exist, but I would say it's less unique to New Zealand. I think there's an imbalance of skill often between well-resourced private parties who can pay for the best lawyers and governments trying to deal with contractors. So I don't think that's so much of a unique New Zealand problem, at least. Secondly, you're right that the old Ministry of Works didn't always do direct construction, but there were periods where it did. So that it kind of went in phases, just as it also at times did a lot of building of roads, and at other times built rail and worked on other things. I think that including through bringing in expertise from the private sector, you could rebuild capacity. And one of the things that the state could do is skill up a lot of people. And one of the things that I heard in some of the interviews I did for that project was that the Ministry of Works did skill up a lot of people who often went and worked in the private sector in lots of roles. And I think we have to start somewhere in building back state capacity. And part of that is having a plan, and maybe an ambitious plan that could get public servants excited and remoralised after being demoralised for so many years of cuts. As for efficiency, I think in some ways it could be more efficient. As you said, governments borrow more cheaply than the private sector, an argument we should be using much more in favour of government action. Government has lower interest rates because of its ability to tax. There are economies of scale that potentially the government could benefit from, which could achieve efficiencies, though some of those economies of scale exist with large private operators as well. I think integrating services, rather than having siloed services with far too many contracts, could actually improve efficiency. But also I think a Ministry of Greenworks would pursue a broader range of goals.
I just want to touch briefly on tax. I want to hazard a guess that you're both proponents of progressive tax reform. After a few years of inaction in this space, what are your assessments now of the prospects of progressive tax reform in New Zealand?
I think there's going to be a pretty vivid debate about tax in the next 18 months in the run-up to the election. Chris Hipkins is on record as saying that Labour will have a tax policy this year. And Max Harris knows this better than I do, but there's a vibrant debate within the Labour Party about whether that's a wealth tax or a capital gains tax. You've already got the Greens, who for the last 2 election cycles have very strongly made the case for a wealth tax. Te Pāti Māori's policy at the last election was tax on everything, more or less, ghost houses, landlord, land banking, wealth tax at, frankly, confiscatory rates. So there's plenty of ideas out there about tax. I think on a capital gains tax, you can see elite opinion starting to shift. So it's now quite orthodox for the Chartered Accountants Association, for instance, to say that they favour a capital gains tax. There are some high-profile New Zealand business people who say they favour it. Famously, the head of one of our big banks said they thought it was inevitable and then got jumped on by the government. So the conditions for getting something like a capital gains tax across the line are stronger than they once were. Nonetheless, any party that comes out in favour of one will still be hit with the usual deluge of attacks and misinformation. You can already see the line against the capital gains tax shifting, I think, because I think the opponents of it are aware that they're starting to lose the argument on the basic, well, income is income, because that's actually very hard to argue with. And so the new line is the New Zealand economy is struggling. Our one great advantage for attracting overseas investors is that we don't have a capital gains tax. Now, this is nonsense. There's no evidence that a capital gains tax has ever stopped anyone from investing in anything. If that were the case, then literally almost every other single OECD country would have real problems with people investing, because literally almost every other single OECD country has a capital gains tax. But you can see the arguments start to develop, and they will be made very strongly. Nonetheless, there's definitely shifts, I think, around the tone and vibe of a capital gains tax. Whether that's true of a wealth tax, I think, is potentially a different matter.
Yeah, I broadly agree with all that. I think the ground is well prepared for a debate about a capital gains tax and the introduction of a capital gains tax. The other counter-argument to it, and the Luxon line, is that we can't tax our way to growth, which is a bit glib because, in my view, the imbalance of the economy, which is partly created through the under-taxation of real estate and housing, is contributing to inadequate growth, in my view, because there's not enough investment in the rest of the productive economy, and we shift that through introducing a capital gains tax, and we potentially enable more growth. So I think that's one available response to the Luxon line. I think, I'm not sure whether you'd agree with this, but I think that in some ways a capital gains tax, if it was introduced, would just widen the definition of income, but there's potentially less political potency in that tax and opening up a bigger debate about wealth and class. And I think that actually a wealth tax, which has been implemented in other countries, would be a better way to open up that kind of debate. And I also think we're undertaxed, and there's a value judgment there, but in my view, we're undertaxed in a bunch of other areas in New Zealand. I mean, for example, we don't talk very often about how GST is almost universal in New Zealand, but how the finance sector is exempted from GST. And sometimes the technical reasons given for that I'm not persuaded by. At the time that GST was introduced, even Dom Brash, I believe, opposed that exemption. And that's an area where the finance sector is undertaxed. Remember, Jane Kelsey talks about the FIRE economy, the finance, insurance, and real estate, and how that has too much weight in the New Zealand economy, partly because of taxation. We're not talking enough, I think, about inheritance and how that locks in a class society. And just finally, I think Max alluded to this. I should disclose. I have been involved in some debates about this within the Labour Party because I rejoined the Labour Party, and I just wanted to mention this, not to spend too much time on it, because I think whether to become a member of a political party is a decision that we can think of when thinking about how we push back on this current government and how we take part politically. And I have lots of friends in the Greens and lots of work with Te Pāti Māori, but just to say briefly about why I made that choice, in my view, we need a really strong... in my view, we can't bypass the state if we're wanting to transform the economy and we're wanting to transform our constitution. And I think that we need a strong enough party that can transform the state. And my assessment is that the Labour Party is the best way forward. But I think there will be lots of people in the room with different views on that.
Look, and all I'd add to that, I mean, that line that you can't tax yourself rich, I mean, that's literally the only thing that has ever worked. If you think about the wealthiest countries of Scandinavia, their tax take, if you applied the set of taxes that they have, if you applied that to the New Zealand economy, you'd be taking in $20 to $30 billion more a year in tax. And so you think, I wonder why our public services feel so threadbare and why they seem underfunded constantly. It's because we're $20 to $30 billion a year short of the tax take that is enjoyed by the countries whose public services we most admire. If we're fortunate enough to have travelled and seen some of those public services in operation. So yeah, absolutely, tax yourself rich. That's how it works.
All right, it's nearly time to open the floor to questions. One last question from me. Thinking ahead to the election next year, what three ideas or proposals do you think should be included in a progressive agenda going into that election?
Well, in these contexts, I'm often reminded of a remark by the philosopher G.A. Cohen, who said that the task of the political party is always to remember its eternal values and then apply them to the present moment, which is one of those things that sounds deceptively simple, but absolutely isn't. In my experience of dealing with people who are very engaged in politics, is that often they have lost sight of their original values, or conversely are extremely entrenched in those eternal values, but maybe don't have the clearest idea about how to apply them to the present day. So I think that's the task, in the general sense, facing political parties. And so it's to make their values applicable to the present moment, and so having solutions for the present moment, and in particular, I think having positive solutions, because as you alluded to in the introduction, Ollie, this is a dark time in many senses in the world, and I sense people crying out for positive ideas. So on the economic front, for instance, and echoing maybe a little cautiously some of the abundance philosophy, I think that we should be optimistic and we should be positive about our ability to keep delivering the kinds of increases in prosperity and meaningful improvements in living standards that we saw in the 20th century, at the same time as protecting and indeed regenerating the planet that was so badly damaged in that incredible 20th century increase in material prosperity. Similarly, I think we should be looking at the incredible suite of new technologies that's coming on board, up to and including AI, and saying that we want to absolutely explore the potential of these technologies, but marry that with the determination that they benefit everyone. And some of that thinking is starting to happen. The PSA has just put out a booklet about AI for good, which is a nice contrast to the AI for bad vibe that mostly we get from Silicon Valley, despite what they say. So I think it's about being positive. It's about being optimistic and about looking at what's actually happening, these technological developments, other developments, and saying how do we turn them in a positive direction. I think there also has to be something said about the challenges that are facing New Zealand, specifically in an economic sense. And that is very much a debate about, we're falling behind and, we're not as prosperous as we used to be, and we don't have the capital to invest in New Zealand ventures and New Zealand enterprises that other countries do. There's a discussion there about sovereign wealth funds, about citizens' wealth funds. I would make a little push for my own pet project of Kids KiwiSaver, building savings by enrolling all children at birth, government incentives, top-ups for the poorest families, building wealth for children who would otherwise never have any behind them, building national savings that way. So I think those kinds of positive ideals. And then just lastly, sort of my third thing, I guess, and again around the economy, is I think we have to be able to articulate a positive vision of the economy, and one that's based around building up people. And that's very simple, but I think there's a real opportunity to contrast that with a vision of a government whose plan for the economy seems to be, let's get some very wealthy overseas people to come in and rescue us. That's so much the tenor of their arguments. We'll hold these summits, we'll get foreign investors, we'll bring in all this capital, that'll solve all our problems. And not only is that unconvincing in its own right, I think there's a very good chance to contrast that with an agenda that's actually about believing in everyone in this country, about believing in ordinary New Zealanders and building them up as people, but also as contributors to the economy. Think about how many more entrepreneurs we would have if we didn't tolerate a situation in which 1 child in 8 is growing up in really, really serious poverty. And how are those children going to maximally contribute to the economy? How are they going to fulfill their economic potential, let alone any of the other potentials, if they're growing up in a house that's cold and damp and mouldy and it's making them sick or killing them, or in a house where there's just no room to study because 3 families have crowded into the one house in order to make ends meet? So, we could build a much better economy if we lifted all those children out of poverty, if we invested in welfare to work policies, if we actually backed job seekers who are looking for work but really struggling to get into it, and if we actually had a system where employers invested properly in their staff rather than, as they do too often, I think, regarding them as a cost rather than an asset. So I think there's an opportunity there to articulate a vision that's really positive, that's ground up, that's middle out, in contrast to a very top-down and excessively kind of overseas investor-focused narrative from the government.
I'll try and be quick because you've all been really good at listening, but you probably want to get to questions. But I'm also going to cheat and try and squeeze in a few more into 3, but very quickly. Number 1, I think expanding free universal public healthcare. Number 2, introducing a well-funded Ministry of Green Works. And number 3, restoring rangatiratanga and honouring te tiriti o Waitangi. Let me say something real briefly about each of those. In relation to the first, 2.5 years ago, I found out that I had an aortic aneurysm and I needed semi-urgent surgery. And I had surgery done in Auckland City Hospital, in a public hospital. And if I had let that aneurysm stay as it was without surgery, I could have died. And the public healthcare system saved my life there. And 10.5 years ago, I had also some semi-urgent surgery under the UK NHS. In both cases, it was free. And in both cases, it saved my life. And I think we should be extending the boundaries of that free public healthcare system. And that means universal dental, for example. It means publicly owned GPs. And there's no reason why we couldn't make GPs free as they are in the UK and in other countries, which would be a huge way to address the cost of living crisis. Anyway, I'll go quick. Number 2, a well-funded Ministry of Green Works. So government leading on building infrastructure such as ramping up state housing and interregional passenger rail and borrowing more because we borrow not very much as a country compared to similarly situated countries, and having a wealth tax and other forms of taxation to support public services. And finally, honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi and restoring Tino Rangatiratanga, which is just the promise that we made as a country in 1840. And what that means concretely is that in all those other areas of policy, we're thinking about what rangatiratanga means for dentistry. That means possibly, as some have suggested, a whānau order approach to dentistry, or well-funded resourcing for iwi and hapu to provide oral healthcare, as an example. Some of those policies require a fight because there have been attempts to divide Māori from non-Māori, and we need to stand up against that. But others, I think, would go with the grain of a public that wants to hear more about economic justice and class, and can be a positive unifying story in the same way that Max R. was talking about.
That was excellent. Thank you both for this discussion. Please join me in thanking. Time for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and Philip will head round with a microphone. Show of hands, please. We'll take a couple.
Maybe we can have a woman because of our all-male panel.
Down. Philip will take a mic to you.
Kia ora. Okay, Max and Max, this is a question. Sorry, please excuse me for looking over the top of my glasses. What you've said tonight is fantastic, and I agree with it all. But how do we dismantle such a big beast like neoliberalism, which is, as George Monbiot says, capitalism on steroids? Because if the current system isn't broken down, does it really matter what other frameworks we try and put in place? So you've talked a lot about policies and what we can do, and like I say, I agree with it all. But until we break down the thinking around capitalism and neoliberalism, you know, what difference will it actually make?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we can do it, and I think the start is not feeling hopeless or resigned. And I think what we should realise is that, yeah, neoliberalism, and you know, David Harvey, for example, says we should just be talking about capitalism and a different form of capitalism. But neoliberalism was led by the state, yeah, and imposed by the state. And so, in my view, it also requires a response from the state. So that means making sure that those in government are trying to break it down, and that means undoing privatizations, reclaiming public ownership, reclaiming universalism. So that means putting pressure on political parties and those in government, while at the same time, I think, building political education in the community about a different kind of ethos, about a different kind of society that's not so market-centred. And I do think that each of us taking political action can transform the system and overcome it. And that could mean different things for different people. It could mean joining your union and making sure that your union is fighting against it. It could mean joining a campaign group, for example, Action Station. It could mean joining a political party, but that's not going to be for everyone. It could mean working with your MP or against your MP and pushing back. And crucially, I think it requires collective action. And I've seen 5 to 10 people starting groups that have made a huge difference in this country. Groups like Just Speak, for example, but also local government action groups. And so, you know, others have talked before about, you know, not underestimating how much a small group of people can do to change the world. And I really believe that. So I think it's about thinking about that individual action, thinking about the collective action, and then doing all that we can in those different spaces to ensure we both have change from the state and ongoing pressure and education as a community. Hopefully that's the start of an answer to a big question.
All right. Show of hands. How we have Valerie there in the mask, and then up the front here.
Yes, awesome to hear from both of you. I just wanted to ask, like, I think there's some analysis internationally that would say the centre-left is responsible for the rise of the populist right? The failure of the centre-left to deliver meaningful change. Is that an analysis that you would subscribe to, I guess, is the first part of that question. Certainly, some of the research that the CTU has been doing around there, reimagining Aotearoa, said the Sixth Labour government was really too late in doing a lot of the things that they wanted to do or didn't do any of them, like some of the tax reform stuff. So what's gonna change the next time around? How do you prevent that, or how do you enable the more fundamental change that's really needed?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, and thanks for all the work that you've done, Valerie, in this space as well. I agree that the politics that has been occupied by so-called centre-left parties since the 1990s has contributed to the rise of proto-fascist and fascist movements, because I think that the consensus that was left to ferment on privatisation, on contracting out, on high prison populations, left people feeling broken, alone, burned out, lonely, and feeling like there was no alternative. And I think that the right has offered, the far right and the right has jumped into the vacuum that was left and offered alternatives. I mean, in the UK at the moment, as many people will know, a very centrist or possibly even right-leaning Labour Party under Keir Starmer has led to profound disappointment, if you look at the polling, and the rise of the Reform Party from Nigel Farage. And I was told recently that Nigel Farage proposed the nationalisation of steel, a policy that you would associate with the left. But I think what we should think about is, what were those politics, and how could we build a different kind of politics, and remaking, what is the kind of common sense of our politics, which I think should be about reclaiming universalism, public ownership, the labour movement, championing income support, internationalism, titility in this country. And my personal view is that for some of us, there is important work to be done within political parties, trying to rebuild a different kind of politics. And different people have different views about which political party should be the vehicle for that. But then I also think, crucially, we need social movements and groups on the outside challenging the failures of the centre and the right, and doing the work that you and others have done, Valerie, and to ensure that we don't go on in the same way.
And if I could just add to that, one phrase that has always stuck in my head in the worst possible way is the fact that a lot of Democrats in the US, as Democrats with a capital D, have long referred to large parts of central North America as flyover country. So in their view, it is country you just fly over. The Midwest, all those poor sort of rural American communities that have been decimated, was where the deplorables live, exactly. And that is such a contemptuous term, and people know it, and they know the attitudes that sit alongside it. So I think in that sense, yes, there has been some complicity. The other thing I would say is that one of the failings has been, amongst progressives, has been a failure to rethink how democracy works and to continue the work of democratisation, which of course has long been a concern of multiple left-wing movements. So, I sometimes use this analogy, it's a little bit glib, but I think it works in the sense that very often, we are trying to run 21st century software on 20th century hardware when it comes to our democracy. We still have a democratic system that relies very heavily on the idea that we elect people and then they go and do the politics, and then maybe we come back 3 years later and we put a tick in a box again. And what I think people have not argued anywhere near strongly enough for is the change in the very system of democracy which shifts power back much closer to the people. And so that can mean things like the things that I always talk about in these sorts of forums, citizens' assemblies, creating forums where ordinary people can come together and solve problems, where conventional politics has got log-jammed, participatory budgeting, where you're getting actual communities to allocate parts of of local council budgets, all kinds of things which actually trust the average person to shoulder the burden of taking some of the most difficult decisions that we face as a country, because these experiments, and they happen more and more in other countries, have shown over and over that people are capable of bearing that burden if we just trust them. And I think that is such a powerful antidote to the kind of flyover country view of the world that it's one that we really need to lean into. And it's one that I think is also a direct response to the kind of Trumpian sense you've been let down by the elites. Obviously, it is a discussion that can get very technocratic very quickly, and I'm sometimes guilty of that. But the essential point about doing politics closer to the people, I think, is essential.
Down the front here, Philip.
Thank you. This is a more specific question, but you've talked about health system and about contracting, the public-private partnership, stuff like that. But the thing that gets my goat is education, specifically the student loan system, which, from my position, is absolutely pernicious. And I just look at the sort of support I had when I finished my undergraduate degree. I had very little debt at all, but my grandchildren are going to be, they don't know what they're getting into, really. And what we've got is a system where accrual accounting makes it an asset in the government's books to have a lot of students owing a lot of money, and it's horrible.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I'm fortunate to be someone who came through the university system really only just as student fees were starting to ramp up and loans and everything associated with it. And also thanks to my very generous parents who are in the audience, but I would have said that even if they weren't. I escaped without that kind of student loan debt, which I think is really crippling, and there's been surveys out about that recently, that it is really harming people in their life, the psychic burden of that debt, but also the obstacles to buying a home and all sorts of things like that. It's a complicated question, because if you were going to increase education spending anywhere, and if you thought the funds were constrained, you would probably start with primary education or early childhood education. But I do think that certainly in an ideal world, we should move back to the system that many OECD countries still have, where tertiary education is essentially free. And I think you can make a good argument that the only fair way to pay for tertiary education is through a graduate tax, because while it is true that graduates, university graduates in particular, earn more than other people do, that's not universally true. And so if you do a social work degree, for instance, your earnings are not going to be huge. So even if you think that tertiary education is a very, very substantial private benefit, the only fair way to claw that back from people is if they actually derive the benefit, and that's a thing you will only see afterwards, and so that would look like a graduate tax. And then you might say, well, okay, we're going to have a graduate tax, why don't we just have higher income tax rates on all top earners, which would be much more straightforward. And so you arrive at the, I think, logical position that the only fair way to fund tertiary education is out of the tax system.
Just to add, I think like one of the most or a damaging part of the student loan system is how it also reinforces a market-centred, kind of money-centred society in the following way. It means that people are left after going to the university, if they have the privilege of going to university, needing to take certain jobs in order to pay off those loans, and not having the time to get involved in social movements, get involved in political campaigns. Also, not being able to take jobs that might be lower paid and in the public interest. So I'm in law, like a generally pretty privileged profession, but in trying to encourage more people to go into community law centres and to do public interest law, a lot of people just say, understandably, I have to pay off my student loan. And so you have fewer people equipped with the skills to try to challenge that same system that introduced interest on student loans.
Time for one more question, Philip. This man here.
Yeah, how do we confront the current government's economic policy, which is monetarist? We have to control inflation. We have to bring interest rates down. We have to cut back in terms of government spending, and we have to repay debt. And they're about to say next year, oh, we've got inflation down, we've controlled debt, and therefore we're the economic managers. Now, it seems to me we need to have an alternative up front to that to actually confront that policy, because Luke Malpass in the Post has it every bloody day, you know. He might as well be a National Party journalist, you know. So we need to.
Well, look, I won't have a word said against my boss at the Post, but you know that notwithstanding, yeah. Look, I mean, I do think there has to be an economic alternative, and I think between us we've tried to sketch out elements of that. It probably does need to be articulated with greater clarity and, dare I say it, simplicity, because that's always useful in politics. But yes, on your specific points, for instance, the way that we deal with inflation in this country is we put the economy into recession and we drive up unemployment. And that's extraordinarily damaging, and it's extraordinarily wasteful of people's potential, especially when, in the cost of living and inflation spike that we just lived through, the main driver of that was very clear from local and international research, was corporate profiteering. Was massive increases in margins from companies taking advantage of, you know, a sudden economic shock. And so I think we need to be better prepared next time for things like excess profit taxes, which shouldn't even be that controversial because they were implemented in the UK under a Conservative government, for instance. Yet another example, I think, of how narrow our thinking has got in New Zealand around economic matters, even things that Conservatives think are perfectly normal in other countries we have somehow managed to rule out of court. But yes, I do think we need an economic alternative. Like I said, it needs to involve investing in people, making clear that we build it from the ground up, while also respecting the environment. We need to be talking much more about the circular economy. I think the fact that we should be creating jobs in renewable energy and in repairing things and in building things that last, not in short-term stuff that just ends up in waste. I think there are plenty of ideas out there. I think we've been articulating them. I think they just need to be brought together.
Yeah, thanks for your question and your hoodie, which I like. I agree with what Max said. Yeah, I think we need an alternative narrative on public debt. We need to say more clearly that holding down public debt in this country is a way to hold down investment in health and education and social services. And that is a choice that we've made, and we need to kind of open that up. Also on inflation, as Max was saying, you know, this government likes to say that, you know, no party has a monopoly on care and that it is caring, but it does seem that the right of politics is more indifferent to higher levels of unemployment. And we can tell a story about that and why unemployment matters and creates scars in our economy, and I totally agree. And coming back to the whole narrative, I don't want to apologise for the fact that we have used terms like universalism and neoliberalism, because I do think there is a strain of anti-intellectual thinking in New Zealand culture, and I actually think we need to push back against that. And we are a smart country, and we're able to grapple with these concepts, and they make sense to people. People just have different language to use. And actually, in many Māori spaces that I've been in, I sense like a deep appreciation of ideas and deep thinking that I think non-Māori spaces could learn a lot from. So I don't apologise, I think, for talking about these concepts, but we do, as Max said, need to make these real to people, acknowledge that people are going to use different words for the same ideas we've been conveying, and think about how we communicate. And one, I think, powerful vehicle for communication is values, something I think Max mentioned as well. And thinking about how values like community and care connect to people. And then also, as Max also said, tying those values to very specific ideas, for example, Ministry of Green Works or universal dental. So yeah, the very last thing I'll say tonight is, yeah, I hope you don't leave feeling gloomier than when you arrived. And I think there are lots of reasons for hope.
All right, that's all we've got time for tonight, but thank you all for coming. See you all, I hope, at the next Fabian session. And please join me again in thanking Max and Max one last time.